The search was grueling and occasionally desperate, but ultimately successful. For the first time, the FBI was able to locate human remains in a closed landfill cell. Here to tell us about the breakthrough are FBI Jacksonville Special Agents Lauren Regucci and Bill Logan. Welcome.
Good
Thank
morning.
you.
Thanks for being here. So just over a little over 5 years ago, you were in a very different place, January 2020. Tell us where you were at the time and what you were doing.
Sure. We started on the 20th up at the Chester Island landfill in Folkestone, Georgia, and we began our setup process to search that landfill based on information that Bill had gotten from the Clay County Sheriff's Office and assisting with their investigation. We decided that that was where our victim was going to be, and so we started to make a plan toward doing that in October 2019, but weren't able to execute that until January of 2020.
And you should tell us perhaps a little bit about the case that you were investigating and why you were in a landfill in the first place.
Of course. Great credit to Clay County Sheriff's Office Robbery Homicide Unit for putting together a very thorough investigation very quickly. Detective Fryer and Sergeant Calhoun answered a lot of questions in a very short order that allowed us to determine that Miss Mauldin's body was in this landfill and that the next step was going to be doing an extensive search of that landfill in order to answer the questions we needed and put this case together.
And this was Susan Mauldin. She lived in Fleming Island and she'd gone missing.
Yes. She was reported missing, and within a few days, Clay County Sheriff's Office had identified a primary subject, had begun putting together all the pieces of the case and processed the scene and determined that they were going to need assistance from FBI specifically to conduct this search. We had just a year before conducted a similar search at the same landfill, and relationships we'd built with Clay County and with waste management at that landfill service allowed us to quickly identify what was needed for next steps.
Yeah. And that's a grim task, searching a landfill, certainly. The investigators initially were able to determine that a contractor that Miss Mauldin had worked with was the chief suspect.
That's correct. The victim, Miss Mauldin, had gotten in touch with this contractor in order to do a renovation of her bathroom and had paid him $12,000 toward this renovation. He had done the tear out work, but had not done any of the completion of the renovation. So after months of trying to either get him to work or to get her money back, my understanding is that she finally said, if you don't give me back this money, I'm going to call the police. And then she was never heard from again. So her friends were aware of the fact that she was going to have this meeting with the suspect, Corey Bindrum. And when they didn't see her after a day, they got concerned and reached out to the Clay County Sheriff's Office.
So this, as we said, was almost exactly 5 years ago. And you've just released some never before seen photos of this landfill search. Why was it that the search began to focus on this Georgia landfill? How did you all determine that was the spot that you were going to look at?
So Corey Bindrum was, after being the last person to see Susan Mauldin, then transported her body to Rosemary Hill landfill, which is a Clay County transfer station, essentially. That station is no longer an active landfill. It does not process the waste there. It then transfers everything from that location up to Chester Island landfill in Folkestone, Georgia. Again, lots of assistance from waste management in helping us track that movement and determine exactly date and time from information Clay County Sheriff's Office put together to be able to narrow down, okay, which loads are we talking about in terms of in need of searching, and then where those ended up within the Georgia landfill.
And we should say, for people who are watching our live stream, we are looking at some photos of that search effort. Describe, if you can, a little bit the conditions that you were dealing with there, Lauren, and what it was like to be a part of that search.
Well, the conditions are as horrible as you can imagine in terms of just all kinds of household garbage, medical waste, construction debris, a lot of hazardous material in the landfill, not just hazardous to somebody going in there and searching around. Um, we were fortunate that it was January, even though it was very cold. The temperature was around 30 to 40 degrees during the day. Um, but the previous landfill we had done was in July. And so, with the temperature at about 115 degrees in the shade. So, this was a little bit better. We had tents set up for climate control, but people were able to work a little bit more, a little bit longer than they were in the July landfill. You've got basically you have to wear all kinds of personal protective equipment. You have to wear steel toe boots. You have to wear gloves. You have to wear gloves inside of gloves. You have to wear Tyvek, and you'll see that in some of the photos. You have to wear a hat and goggles. You have to have a half-face respirator just for any of the things that you might be stirring up as you're going through and raking. And it's just very backbreaking work because you're using these potato rakes to just scrape through and see what it is that you can see. That's also part of the big challenge is that everything tends to look the same once it gets processed through the landfill. Everything is kind of this grayish brown color, and things start to blend in. And even though you would think, oh, well, of course we'll see this will stand out, it doesn't.
Yeah. I'm curious how you train your eye to find things that are relevant to your case. I think in this case, you knew that the suspect had bought some contractor bags, and possibly those would be something to look for, containing a body. But I would guess that a contractor bag is even more difficult to look for than, human remains. I mean, it would sort of look like everything else in there, which is a garbage bag.
Yes, we had the benefit in this case that contractor bags were pretty specific, unique looking bags, white bags with a big orange logo. Again, when we found these, there were other bags in there, but when we found Miss Mauldin within those bags, they were not the same color. Obviously, they did not look exactly the same. We went to a lot of effort on the front end to try to identify what things might look like to provide people kind of a heads up, searchers a heads up before getting out there. So we had photos of Miss Mauldin's laptop and phone, of clothing that she had, some that we knew was not found during the search of her home that might still be on her person. We also had some forensic anthropologists come in and kind of give us an idea of different potential states of decomposition of human remains that we might be looking for. This being the first successful one in FBI history meant that nobody really knew exactly what condition she would be in, but we had some good guesses in terms of the timeline we were on, and other prior scenes and background. We did a lot of work on the front end just to give people kind of a reminder. And then within the tents every morning, everyone was briefed, but then within the tents every morning as people prepared for that search, there was a binder with photos just to kind of refresh people's memory each day.
Hmm. And this is you described the conditions are not great. It's difficult to recognize something, when you're seeing it. But what was particularly unique about this search and the success of it was that this was not just a landfill where things had been dumped, but it had already been processed. Can you describe why that's a different set of circumstances than just going to something that's been freshly disposed of?
Sure. With landfills, it's a business that's based on airspace, so they can only go up so high, and so they have a vested interest in trying to pack down all of the garbage as far down as they can, because if they go up to a certain height, then they're out of airspace and they have to close the landfill for good. This one I think has like 40 years left on it, but it still means that they're going to, when they dump the contents of dump trucks and the garbage, they have to dump it in a certain way, and they have to keep track of where they're dumping it, so that they're not just creating one big pile in one corner. They're spreading it out, and then they're packing it down. So there are these basically things that look like giant steamrollers that have pegs on the roller that are just giant compactors, and they just roll back and forth, back and forth, back and forth all day. And they're just packing everything down and getting all of the gases out and everything like that. So once something has been put through that kind of process, it's going to be not just destroyed, but also spread out. So if you think about, well, I have this one bag of trash, that bag of trash is now going to be spread out over a huge area because it's all been flattened and then rolled back and forth.
Wow.
And unfortunately, that's the situation that we were faced with, going to the landfill, trying to look for Miss Mauldin.
If you're just joining us, we are talking to two local FBI agents who worked on a successful search of a landfill in the case of a Clay County woman who was murdered in 2019.
19.
Yeah. And if you want to join the conversation, you can give us a call at 904-549-2937. You can also email firstcoastconnect@wjct.org or reach out on social media. I want to ask you about the preparation. Obviously, there was a lot to do to get ready for this search, but you determined rather quickly, or investigators with the Clay County Sheriff's Office, I'm not sure, determined rather quickly that this would be a suspect location. I believe you were able to kind of put a hold on that area of the landfill so that it didn't continue to be filled and processed and over and over. But there was a chunk of time between, maybe October 2019 and January when you were able to begin this search. Why was there that time lag? How did that hinder what you were able to do?
So we were lucky to determine very quickly, again, Clay County Sheriff's Office did a great job to answer enough questions that we knew to get to Waste Management to go talk up to Chester Island Landfill and coordinate with them very quickly within a week of her disappearance. And that ended up being vital because it reduced the amount of waste that we were going to be required to search. They were great partners, and I should reference that the year prior we had been up to Chester Island Landfill in a different search in the Jolene Cummings case, and had built a relationship and kind of a rapport with that specific landfill and waste management there. And they were able to then identify, okay, there's a couple days that we are focused on. This is the cell, the area that we need to search based on those days of the garbage arriving. And then they were able to hold it so that it was no longer being used. Again, as luck would have it, we had sort of reached the end of a corner of a cell during that time frame, the interim between her murder and our arrival. But so then they blocked that space off, and so within that first week, we were able to identify and cordon off the section that we would later come back to search, so that we knew it would not be materially changing between the time we identified it and the time we searched it.
But then why does it take so long to kind of get up and running and get that search underway?
So we have to coordinate with our laboratory division up at Quantico, because something like this, you're not just going to grab a couple of shovels and run up there and start digging. It's a massive undertaking, and it requires a lot of personnel, and you have to set up somewhat of an infrastructure there at the landfill site. And what I mean by that is we have some units that come down to help set up not only the tents, but they arrange for water to be brought out to the site. They arrange for porta potties to be brought out. They arrange for all of our PPE. So we have, at the lab, we have our evidence response team unit, which is the program unit that manages all of the evidence response teams across the country, of which I'm the senior team leader for Jacksonville. And there is also a sister unit called the Technical Hazards Response Unit. And that unit is basically our safety unit. They come down and make sure that anything that we're doing out on scene, that we're being safe. So in order to get on their schedule, first in order to convince them that, hey, we have to do another landfill search. They were not happy to hear that from me after we had just done an unsuccessful one in 2018. But I called them and I said, if you will send down a representative from ERTU and a representative from THRU, both people that I know who have seen landfill searches before, I said, come down, see it for yourself. Don't just take my word for it. Listen to the case, listen to the investigation, see that there is really nowhere else that she can be. It's not that she just went off on a cruise somewhere. Come down and see the landfill for yourself. And when they came down and saw that we were basically in a corner of that one cell, which meant that we had two hard edges, so we couldn't go in those directions. So it made it a little bit easier for us to navigate. When they saw that, they said, okay, so we'll get you on the schedule for January, and they came down and provided all of the things that I was telling you about. Also, a base of operations where we have communications. We've got places to meet. We've got areas kind of sectioned off where food was brought in for us, so we would have a place to kind of recuperate before we went back out. So they set up this entire infrastructure there at the landfill.
Still a big area, though. We're talking about roughly the size of.
It's over 150 acres, and just for scale, this landfill capacity is over 60 million metric tons, and receiving upwards of 1.5 million metric tons per year. The scale of it is enormous. So that is certainly was part of the initial concern, but in terms of preparation, also just coordinating resources and personnel to be able to make sure that we could do this smoothly, so that once we started, we knew we could be there for the duration until we were successful.
I mean, you mentioned you had a relationship with the landfill people because of this prior search, and I'm guessing that much like your team in DC, they were none too thrilled to learn that they're going to once again have, investigations, crews perched on their landfill. I guess it somewhat disruptive to operations as well for them.
Yes, they were extremely gracious. Again, having built that relationship prior, I think they understood exactly what to expect from us, and we understood what to expect from them. We relied very heavily on their guidance in terms of initial identification of where our search area would start, but then also with providing experts with dump trucks and with excavators, and who were able to very honestly surgically do their job so that we could do our job and make it feasible for us to work through so much material.
So you mentioned the previous search. That was the disappearance and presumed murder of Jolene Cummings. She was a Yulee hairstylist who went missing. Ultimately, her killer was sentenced, convicted, but the body was never found. What were some of the, other than it being July when you were doing this search, which must have just been, ghastly hot, what were some of the challenges that prevented that from being a successful search, do you think?
I think the difference with that search was just the amount of material. We were looking, with Miss Mauldin's case, we were looking through about 2 days worth of trash. Whereas with Jolene Cummings, it was upwards of 8 days. And when you think of 2 days worth of trash, and you think of in your household, it's only 2 days worth of trash. That's not that much. But then you think these are 2 trash collection days. So imagine how much trash you put in. My trash only gets picked up once a week. So that's a week's worth of trash. And so if you think of that throughout North Florida, all the way down to Daytona Beach, all of that trash. So for 2 days, it doesn't sound like that much, but then you think about a week's worth of trash for every household from here to Daytona, and all the way up. So all that is going in the landfill. So 2 days worth of that trash. And so when you think about 8 days worth of trash, the numbers are just the tonnage that we have to go through is so much. So that was, I think, the first problem. The second issue for me, looking back on it, was that it wasn't a hard corner like what we had at this site. It was more in the middle, and so regretfully, we could have been off by a few feet, and we just never would have known. So we did the best that we could with that. But I also will say that having had that experience in 2018 really did make it better for the 2020 search. We knew we could hit the ground running. We knew what we had to do. We set up the teams faster. We got rolling faster. We prepared everyone to say, well, it might be a slow start. And someone said, gosh, you guys had us worried that it was going to take so long to get rolling, and you guys got in there and you were already ready to go. And it was like, well, we've had that experience before, so we kind of knew what to expect, which was, it did help, I think, just mentally to prepare for what we needed to do.
And so this search took how many days before you were able to recover her remains?
We recovered the first piece of her 9 days in, on October 29th, I believe.
January 29th.
Sorry, January 29th. The case was in October of 2019. So 9 days in, again, 12 plus hour days, dusk till dawn, dawn till dusk, and just long, grueling days with 40 plus searchers per day, and then a whole host of assistants to just keep that operation moving smoothly and people focused on safety. Um, by a few days in, you start to have just questions about, all right, are we moving at the right pace? Do we need to be moving faster? Are we in the exact spot? And we start looking for anything to just make sure we can hone in our people as well as possible. And one thing that we learned, I think the year prior, that I learned at least, was in looking through, for instance, specific paper mail, newspapers or bills or that kinds of thing. You're able to start identifying if we're in the right time range and locations, obviously addresses as well, which gave us sometimes indications. Okay, well maybe within this cell there are going to be lots of different parts of the territory that we're looking through, from Daytona again all the way up to Georgia, but we can start getting a sense of, like, are we looking at Clay County garbage here?
Mm-hmm.
And that did help us make some decisions about where we might focus next.
Can you describe what it was like to make that discovery after all those days of searching?
It was truly overwhelming, I think, for both of us, and for the team that was out there. I happened to be up on the top of the area where we were searching. We called it a deck. This is where the dump truck would bring their load up to the top and then dump it, and then an excavator would kind of level it so that it was safe for the searchers to go through. And I had been up there, and I mean, you start to get loopy after 9 days of doing this, and thinking about your career going up in smoke. And someone nudged me and said, "I think that the team is trying to get a hold of you." And there was one team that was searching, and other teams were recuperating. And so I walked over there, and the person who was whose team I had assigned team leaders to every team, so that team leader was kind of a jokester, and he was, he would pull things out of the landfill and say, "Oh, we found," and it would be a doll or something like that. And so he said, "We found her." And I said, "Okay, what do you got now? What joke are you playing on me now?" And he said, "No, look." And he pointed down, and I knelt down, and it was the back of her skull with hair still attached. And I had a moment, just of it's a combination of relief and sadness, and just the thought that, wow, we're actually going to be able to do this. This is amazing. So so then everything slows down, everything stops, and we have to say, okay, now that we found this one piece, let's keep going. Let's see what else is around us. So we had to basically, it was like a hand and knee search from that point, just to see what else could we find in that general area. So that's what we did until it got too dark to keep going. And then we started the next day and recovered more of her remains that day.
Oh, it's extraordinary. What are the problems that you encounter? I mean, obviously, that's an enormous finding for a case like this, but I would guess that there are also problems with evidence being compromised, being in a place where there's so many other inputs, whether it's DNA or other things. So, how vulnerable is evidence to being, challenged in court or being admissible ultimately when you're dealing with that kind of environment?
I think there was some question about DNA not being present on some of her remains that should have been, according to the defense, should have been there. I mean, yeah, everything is cross contaminated. It's just the nature of how it is. Um, the bottom line for us was that she was in the landfill, and she did not belong in the landfill. And how did she get in the landfill? It was very clearly, it was her. We found that out the next morning because the medical examiner had taken her jawbone that we had found and compared it to her dental records. So he was able to come back the next morning and say, yes, this is her. And yeah, that's not where she's supposed to be.
Yeah.
If I might, from an investigative standpoint, the reason we were in this landfill was entirely based on the movements of Corey Binderum. So her being there was the evidence that it was Corey Binderum who had murdered her. The cross contamination was certainly something we discussed and tried to account for in a landfill, as you might imagine. there's not much that you can account for in terms of what has already happened by the time you get there. In terms of maintenance, though, especially knowing that we were going to need to come back a day later, there are efforts made to make sure you secure the scene and are able to say we controlled this from the moment where we found what we knew was evidence in this case. And so we brought out an armed team that stayed the night, not focused on anyone trying, any person trying to harm the scene or question it. Specifically in this case, we're most focused on wild hogs and potential animals that might get in and cause some kind of disturbance or confuse the way that we found it. But that certainly is part of the design, is that we were able to, as soon as we identify, okay, we are on the search with positive evidence, we're gonna own it until we are ready to completely release it.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned, Lauren, this kind of being a senior team member. You have trained evidence response teams around the country, from around the country at FBI headquarters in Quantico. You train them because there's this need to be able to work together collaboratively, even if you're coming to a scene in an area that none of you are familiar with. And I believe that one of the scenes that you were involved with was the Pulse nightclub shooting.
Correct. Yeah, all of the ERT members are trained in what we call the 12-step process. And what this does is, first of all, it's a process, it's a thought process that we use while we go on scene. So, and it can be adapted from everything from a 1-bedroom apartment to a landfill scene. It also allows us to be a force multiplier. So with everyone being trained the same way, when we have to deploy to something like Pulse nightclub or any kind of complex crime scene, we are able to seamlessly integrate with the rest of the team members. So that was a Tampa case. Tampa was the first responding team on site, and we were able to join in. Miami joined in. Atlanta came down, and we're all able to work together because we're all trained the same way. So it is a huge resource out there, because for a local sheriff's office or a local police department, if they're involved in something and they're like, wow, this is too much for our small department, we can throw in an incredible amount of resources to try to assist with that.
Can you just talk about how it's different to be processing a scene that has kind of national significance as opposed to something that is just sort of a local, crime?
You're very aware of the fact that the media is on you. You're very aware of the high profile nature of it. One of the things that I told my team early on when we deployed to Pulse nightclub was that, we're staying in Orlando. We're staying in the hotel in Orlando. You can't turn on the news without there being a story about one of the victims. You can't open your phone and look at the internet to see anything, and it's all about the victims. So I told my team, listen, while you're here, try not to look at any of that media, because when you leave the scene, you'll be able to look at it. I did this. You'll be able to look at the victim stories. You'll be able to understand the gravity of everything that happened and the tragedy that occurred. But while we're here, we have a job to do. So we have to put that out of our minds and just focus on what job needs to be done here and what we can do to help these victims' families. We can't do anything to help the victims themselves, but we can do everything that we can to make sure that we are operating this crime scene in the most just the way to preserve it, and to make sure that everything is done in the manner that it needs to be done.
Yeah. Well, it's extraordinary work you all did on that, the Susan Mauldin case. Congratulations on all of it and the breakthrough that you had.
Thank you.
Lauren, Regucci, Bill, Logan, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.